Shalom and welcome to session 2 of our journey through the Holy Land. I'd like to invite you now to join with me as we begin to move east through the Holy Land into an area known as the Galilee, where Jesus grew up and where many of the early parts of his ministry are recorded in Scripture, including the Sea of Galilee. I think you'll find this session particularly interesting regarding those events in Jesus' life that you've read many times in the Gospels and the very places where those things took place. So, let's go to the Galilee. Shalom and welcome to session 2 of our journey through the Holy Land. Now, your first Hebrew lesson. You have heard me use this word shalom a few times, and perhaps you've heard this word before, and also perhaps you've heard it translated to mean peace. Well, it does mean that, but when our Jewish friends use that phrase as a greeting, or also when they say goodbye, when they're parting company with someone, shalom actually is more comprehensive in meaning than just peace. It means, may God bless you with every good thing, which of course includes peace. So, we greet one another with the word shalom, and as we part company, we also wish them shalom. Now, a second Hebrew word, or 2 words actually. This session, we are recording this session actually in the morning, so I should have said to you, Boker Tov. Boker meaning morning, Tov meaning good. Actually, it's morning good, but in English we translate it good morning. So shalom and Boker Tov. Well, today in this session, we will start moving east. But before we do that, let's recap very quickly what we did in first session. If you remember that we began by flying into Tel Aviv, the second largest city in Israel, and the most western feeling of the cities in Israel. The city probably you would resonate with the most easily. And then, if you'll recall, we started to move up the Mediterranean coast to the north and went to Caesarea, which was the seat of the Roman governor that was built by King Herod. Many excavations there, including an amphitheater that has its acoustical wonder, where they could have thousands of people there without amplification and everybody could hear. And so many other crusader sites and so forth from the Roman era. Then we went still farther to Haifa, the jewel of the Mediterranean, complete with the Baha'i Gardens. We went up on Mount Carmel to witness the battle between the prophet Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And then we went over to the little town of Cana, where Jesus performed his first miracle. Well, today, first, we're going to head a little bit farther north to a town called Akko, or sometimes it's called Acre. And that is one of the places where we go to learn a lot about the Crusaders, because there are many Crusader sites there. But there's also a jewel that even a lot of Israelis don't know about, and it's called the Torah Synagogue. And this synagogue is extraordinary. It was designed after a synagogue that was in Tunisia. But Torah, of course, the 5 books of Moses, and a synagogue is a place in which you teach the Torah. Well, this little synagogue that we go and see is extraordinary because the entire interior of the synagogue is covered in mosaics. There's mosaics all over every floor. The ceilings, the walls, even under stairwells, you find mosaics that tell the story of ancient Israel all the way up to modern times. Now, one of the things you're going to discover about this tour this pilgrimage that we take is that we not only have the opportunity to learn a great deal about our own Christian faith and encounter those places where Jesus walked, but we also learn something about Judaism, about Islam, about the Druze. We learn much about modern Israeli history, as well as Roman times and Crusader times. And it's characteristic of Israel, a place that's just rich with history, because we're talking about several millennia of history. Also, you're going to discover that when you look at some of the different places, that going to Israel is very much one of those wow experiences, but not in the same way that when you go to places like the Alps or Alaska or the Grand Canyon or even Disney. When you go to those places, what you see is a wow experience because it's so amazing and large and fantastic. Even though there are many beautiful places in Israel, it's not quite like that. Israel is a place that you really need to feel. And it's hard to explain until you actually get there. But it is a wow experience because you're actually in the proximity of where many of these stories that we read about took place. And though we don't worship stones and don't worship places, there is something extraordinary about actually being in the proximity of where these miracles and these extraordinary events took place. Well, today, as I said, we're going to start moving to the east and going to the little town, at least it was a very tiny town in Jesus' day, of Nazareth. Now it's a relatively large city, but back then it was a very tiny, insignificant little place. And one of the reasons why we go there is because as you come into town, one of the first things you see is this gigantic Roman Catholic church called the Church of the Annunciation. And this church was built over the site where ever since the first century, Christians have identified as being the home of Mary. When the angel came to announce to her that she was to have a child, and it was a big surprise to her, and the angel also reassured Joseph that this is a miracle, it's a product of the Holy Spirit. And so this big, beautiful church called the Church of the Annunciation is built over that site. And inside the church, it is amazing because all around the main part of the church, there are representations of Mary offered from artists from all over the world. And you could spend all day long just looking at those. But down in the grotto, down in the bottom of the church, is where you can look through and see the remains of Mary's home. Now you might be asking, why do you think that it really is the home of Mary? How do we know this? Well, this is something very important to understand through all of our trip together. Is how do they know that these places were actually the places where these events took place? Well, unlike our modern times, back then, they were very, very adept at oral history. That was a big part of their culture, was that they would share things and remember what they were told by their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. And so we have that, but we have a great debt to Helena. Now, Helena was the Emperor Constantine's mother. And when Helena came to faith, she made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, just like we're doing. And when she got there, she started asking all the locals, well, where did this happen? Where did that happen? And the locals were glad to tell her because they said, well, my granddaddy said that this happened there. His granddaddy told them that, and so forth. Well, when Helena came back home, she told the emperor, you know, we really need to mark these places because as time goes on, people are going to forget and they're not going to know. And so we need to be able to mark them. Well, that then is all through the Byzantine period. They started to put little chapels on all of these different sites. And we are greatly indebted to them that they did it. And of course, over time, those little chapels became bigger chapels and bigger churches. And some people don't like this. They see the landscape of Israel covered with churches all over the place. And that's because when we go to a historic site, we like to go and see the way it looked back then. But in America, we're talking a couple hundred years. And the United States, praise God, has not been overrun repeatedly. But in the Middle East, you have thousands of years of history, and particularly in in the Holy Land has been overrun time and time again. It's a wonder there's anything there to see. There is much there to see. But so with these churches put on top of these sites, we have the opportunity to know with fairly certain where all of these various things occurred. You'll remember that another reason why Nazareth is of great significance is because that's the little town where Jesus grew up, working with his father in his workshop. And even to this day, you can walk a now paved road that was probably the same path that everybody took in the village to go and get their water from the natural spring that is there to this day. And so certainly Jesus and Mary, no doubt, walked that same path to get their water. Also, we remember that in Nazareth, that's the first time Jesus spoke and preached to the home folks in the local synagogue. And at first, the people were very impressed by all that Jesus was saying, until they really started listening to what he was saying and claiming that what Isaiah was talking about was happening before their eyes, meaning himself, and they got very angry. Who do you think you are? They wondered, because we know you. I mean, we saw you grow up. Aren't you the son of Joseph? And who are you to tell us these things? And so, when you're on the way out of Nazareth, you see a very high cliff, and I'm quite certain that's where they tried to throw Jesus off the cliff. And but why not? God can raise up people from our midst. Usually we think of great people and great geniuses and teachers and whatever. They come from somewhere else. Why not? Why can't he raise up somebody within our own family or within our own church community? Don't be surprised whom God might raise up from our youth group or from within our congregation to do something extraordinary. And this was something that the good people in Nazareth had a hard time understanding. And as Jesus said, a prophet is not welcome in his own hometown. Well, from Nazareth, we go from there, and as we go further east, we go over into this, further in the area of Galilee, to the Sea of Galilee. Now, to some degree, it's misnamed. We call it the Sea of Galilee, actually Lake Gennesaret, or sometimes Lake Tiberias. It's actually a lake more than a sea, but it's a very beautiful place. But the first half of Jesus' ministry was pretty much all around the Sea of Galilee and throughout the Galilee area. And if you'll remember, that is where Jesus started calling his disciples to become fishers of men, because the first few, Peter and James and John and some of the others, were fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. And he told them to follow him so they can become fishers of men. But you'll remember a couple extraordinary stories that happened there. Two of them right on the lake. And we do, in fact, take a boat ride out in the middle of the lake. And we have a chance to imagine, looking around, that somewhere on these waters, the disciples were in a boat. And the first storm story, if you'll recall, the storm blew up, and they were all afraid that they were going to capsize. It's very easy for storms to blow up on the Sea of Galilee, either coming from the east, from the desert, or from the Mediterranean, from the west. And Jesus was asleep in the boat. And they wondered, why are you asleep? Wake up. Jesus wanted to know, where's their faith? You have little faith. Don't you realize who's in the boat with you? And this is a tremendous lesson for us all, that when the storms of life blow hardest in our own life, we have to remember the one who said, I will be with you always. It's as if he's in the boat there right with us, and he has the power to calm the storms. But the second storm story has even more detail. And that is that sometimes when we're in the midst of a storm, we don't feel very connected to Jesus at all. And sometimes Jesus comes to us in very profound ways in the midst of the storm. So remember, Jesus is walking across the lake. He's on the water. And when Peter says, well, if it is you, Lord, have me come out to you. And you know what? Jesus calls him to come out. And Peter is actually walking on water as well. Now, what do we learn from this? We learn that when the storms of life are blowing, or when we're struggling with anything, Jesus can enable us to do things we never thought we'd ever be able to do. And certainly, Peter never thought he could walk on water. And sure enough, there he is. But at one point, he starts to sink. Why? Because he took his eyes off of Jesus, and he looked at the storm and thought, oh, how overwhelming. What am I doing? Forgetting that it was Jesus that called him out there, and that Jesus was there with him. And as he went down into the water, Jesus reached down and pulled him out and said, oh, Peter, where is your faith? Profound lessons out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. Well, over on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, there are some very important places that we want to think about. One is called the Mount of the Beatitudes. Well, this is where Jesus gave his famous sermon, probably one of the most important parts of the gospel, called the Sermon on the Mount. And there, of course, is that little chapel at the top, which is actually beautiful. But on the side of that hill is where Jesus delivered his famous Sermon on the Mount. Now, what is the Sermon on the Mount? The Sermon on the Mount is what I like to refer to as the Christian manifesto. That is to say that if you really want to know what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, read the Sermon on the Mount. What does that look like? How do Christians think? How do Christians view the world? How are we taught to relate to one another? And it's all spelled out there in the Sermon on the Mount. And when we go there, we think about that Sermon on the Mount, including the Beatitudes that are included. There's a couple other places on the shore. One of them it's called the Church of the Loaves and Fishes. And this is where the site where Jesus performed the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. And when you go into the little church, since the church is built up, actually, when you go up to where the altar is and you look at the rock that's there, you're actually looking down on the top of the rock where Jesus performed this miracle. And what's the significance of this miracle? Well, a couple of things. One, if you remember, there's a huge crowd, 5,000 people plus were there, and they had been following Jesus around, listening to him teach and watching him heal and all these things. And the disciples came to Jesus and said, hey, you need to send these people away. It's getting late and they need to go get something to eat. And Jesus says, you give them something to eat. What? How can we feed 5,000 people? And oftentimes that is our reaction when there is human need and we think, well, what can I do about it? And Jesus said, you give them something to eat. So he said, well, what is it that you have? Well, we have a couple loaves of bread, a few fish. He said, give them to me. And he performed this miracle and fed the whole multitude. Two things we must remember about this. One, no matter how little you think you might have, you always have enough to share with someone else. But the second thing, and perhaps even more important, is when you think you have just very little resource. Maybe you don't think you have much talent, maybe you think you don't have much time, you don't have this, you don't have that. But when you put it in the hands of Jesus, watch what he can do with it. He's the one that performs the miracle. And when we provide him all that we have, you watch what Jesus can do with it. That's the lesson of the loaves and fishes. Well, another little church, one of my favorites, is called the Church of the Primacy. And it's the site where Jesus had breakfast with the disciples after the resurrection. And that's when he had that conversation with Peter, where he asked Peter 3 times, do you love me? And if you recall that oftentimes when people interpret this story, since it's 3 times, we assume that Jesus is asking Peter, do you love me? So he could say 3 times that he loves him to reverse his denials. Well, when I read scripture, I don't think Peter needed to do that. Because first of all, Jesus forgave everybody from the cross. And because of his sacrifice on the cross, that's already taken care of. I think the story is much more rich than this. And this is where a little bit of Greek knowledge helps. And that is that perhaps you know that in the Greek language, which is a very expressive language, there are several words that are translated love. In English, we just have the one word, love. And we say we love our mother, and we also say we love ice cream. Well, obviously by context, that's two totally different things. But in the Greek language, there are a number of words for love depending on what you're talking about. Well, the only 2 we're going to talk about right now is first the word phila, which is where Philadelphia comes from, city of brotherly love. And phila is that affection or that love that you have for humanity, or you might have for a sibling. But then there's the second word is agape, which is self-sacrificing, unconditional love. And this is the love that Jesus meant when he said, I give you a new commandment to love one another as I have loved you. He's talking about agape. All right, listen to the conversation then between him and Peter. He says, Peter, do you agape me? And Peter says, well, yes, Lord, you know that I phila you. Well, that's not what Jesus asked. He asked, do you have unconditional, just total, complete love for me, sacrificial love for me? And he said, well, we're buds. Of course I love you. We have that brotherly affection. Well, that's not what he asked. He said, all right, well, tend my sheep. So he asked him a second time, Peter, do you agape me? And Peter said, you know that I philo you. Jesus is not getting through to him. And then the third time, Jesus said, Peter, do you philo me? He's changed. And you'll notice that the text says that then Peter was disturbed. He felt bad because Jesus said, do you philo me? Because he realized that Jesus was now coming down to his level. And so Peter says, you know everything about me, Lord. You know that I philo you. Because what Jesus needs to know is, Peter, last time your philo of me, your affection of me wasn't enough. You denied me. What I need to know now as I send you forth to preach the gospel, I need to know that you're all in. I need to know that you agape me. And he goes on to say, because Peter, it's just like when you're a young man, you can go wherever you want, you can take care of yourself, clothe yourself, but when you become an old man, other people decide where you're going to go and are going to have to clothe you. That's what it's going to be like, you being my disciple, because I'm going to send you places where you otherwise may not want to go, and I got to know if you agape me. You see how rich that story is? And it's the same challenge or the same invitation that Jesus has for all of us. Do we just have affection for him? Do we just have respect for him? Or do we love him with our whole being, sacrificially, unconditionally, completely? And that's the significance of that story of the breakfast by the beach. Well, finally, for today, we will make mention then of the city of Capernaum. We call it Capernaum, but actually it means Kafar Nahum, which means the village of Kafar of Nahum, not the Old Testament prophet, but that's what Kafar Nahum means. Kafar Nahum, or we call it Capernaum. Well, that was Peter's hometown. And Jesus spent a lot of time in Kafar Nahum. And that's actually where Jesus performed another healing miracle, this time Peter's mother-in-law. And there's a beautiful church there where when you stand up on the top and you look down into there's a piece of glass, and you look down into what would have been Peter's original home. Now, before we leave the Galilee and go over to the Jordan River, which is where we'll go next time, one last little story I want to tell you back in Nazareth. Nazareth is an extraordinary place in another way, in that actually Nazareth today is about 60% Arab. Most of them are Muslims. And in Nazareth, there is the White Mosque. And the head trustee of the White Mosque is a dear friend of mine, Mr. Fahum, Sheikh Joseph Al-Fahum. And Mr. Fahum's family have been the head trustees of that mosque, dating all the way back to the 18th century. And some of our groups have had the opportunity to visit the mosque and meet Mr. Fahum. And we have certain impressions of Islam and what it's like in the countries surrounding Israel. And we see a lot of difficulties there and a lot of angst between Christians and Jews and Muslims. But I always try to bring the people there to meet Mr. Fahum, because his approach is totally different than what you might expect. And it's a great blessing to meet with him and talk with him. As head trustee, he's the one who decides who the imams are going to be, who are going to teach in the White Mosque. And he instructs those imams that whenever any of the holy days, the high holy days of the other religions are on the calendar, the imams are told to teach the meaning of those high holy days to his congregation and explain to them why it's so important to those who follow those religions. For instance, one time I was there meeting with him in December. Well, Christmas was on its way, and he said he told the imams to point out the fact that in the Quran there is a prophet named Isa. Isa is Arabic for Jesus. And we understand what we mean by the prophet Isa, but this is who the Christians think Jesus is. So you can understand why Christmas is so important to them, and you will respect it. This is what is being taught in the mosque. Because what Mr. Fahum is trying, and his family has always tried to cultivate in Nazareth, is to learn how to be good neighbors with Christians, Muslims, and Jewish people. Well, this picture that we're now putting up on the screen is the three of us. On the left, you'll see yours truly. And on the right, you will see my dear friend, and now I feel very much like a brother, Taki Columbus, who is our tour guide. And in the middle, there is Mr. Fahum. Now that's an extraordinary picture. Three very good friends, an American Christian, a Jewish Israeli, and a Muslim Israeli. They're together in a brotherhood, a communion. And the last thing I'll say about this before we close today is with several of my Muslim friends throughout my travels through Israel, professors, religious people, just everyday citizens. And I'll say to them, you know, you claim Father Abraham. Friend Saki Columbus claims Father Abraham. As a Christian, I claim Father Abraham. That makes us brothers. At the very least, we're cousins. And every time that Muslim person will turn and look at me and say, yes, we are brothers. This is a glimpse of the hope that Israel represents and what we as Christians should be striving toward. No, we're not going to water down our faith just to make them happy, and they aren't going to water down theirs. But there's no reason why we cannot live together as brothers in this otherwise broken world. Now, that doesn't mean that everything in Israel is perfect. Of course, recently in the news, you've heard some unrest, just like we've had unrest here in the United States. But most of the folks within the borders of Israel just simply want to be good neighbors. And when you go there, you feel this, you see this. And it proves to be a wonderful place, not only to visit, but also to live. Well, thank you for joining me for this second session. And next week, we will travel over to the Jordan River, and from there, we will head to Jerusalem. We'll see you then. Shalom!